with COVID cases rising across the country, Matt Hancock has admitted we are at a coronavirus tipping point. So, to stop numbers shooting through the roof, the government says effective action must now be taken.
And despite dire warnings about the economic impact of another national lockdown, the Health Secretary refused to rule it out as an option. Well, joining us now, our global health expert professor, Devi Sridhar from Edinburgh, who says a national lockdown has to have an objective, or just kicking the can down the road. From Cumbria, we can speak to Professor John Ashton, a public health expert whose new book, Blinded by Corona, is highly critical of the government. He says another lockdown would be a disaster. And from Monaco, we're joined by businessman and author Duncan Bannatyne, who warns that without help from the government and the banks, many businesses just wouldn't survive a second lockdown. Duncan, let's start with you. I've got a lot of local business people I know, restaurateurs, club owners, pub owners, all the rest of it, all incredibly worried about this momentum building to perhaps another lockdown, knowing how devastating the first one was. None of them take COVID lightly. They all think it's still a very serious situation, but they're actually genuinely concerned that if another lockdown comes in, their businesses may never recover.
Yeah, I think many businesses are in what we'd call survival mode. I mean, when the lockdown came before, a lot of companies took on, to get to where we are now, took on more debt. Different types of debt, debts to the landlords, debts to the bank, and that debt has grown, and sometimes that debt has got to be paid off. Now, if we're going to lockdown again, they've got to take on more debt, but at one point the banks will say no, the landlords will say no, and it will become more and more difficult, and we have to decide whether or not we're going to continue to run the business, or whether we let the employees go, and that is the hardest decision. So many employees so many people are going to lose their jobs in this.
Professor Ashton, this is one of the potentially devastating effects of another lockdown, is the economic effects, but also the effects on people's mental health. We know that was very serious during the lockdown, but also the effects on other parts of the health service. I mean, I think a number of people are concerned about how serious coronavirus is in the pantheon of conditions and whether lockdown is the right way to deal with it. What's your view?
Well, it is a desperate situation that we're staring in the face. It feels like Groundhog Day. It feels like the beginning of March all over again, when we finished up with this complete lockdown, which in my view would not have been necessary if we had proper testing, tracing and isolating in place. And we still haven't got that, sadly. We could have just locked down parts of the country in the first round of this, because the virus initially was concentrated in the home counties into the Midlands, not in the southwest, not up the east coast, not in the northeast, but we locked down everywhere. We've now got a situation where there doesn't seem to be a lot in the southwest. We ought to be aiming to do local and regional lockdowns, targeted control measures where there are outbreaks, but we're still suffering from this fetish about giving these huge contracts to Serco and Deloitte, rather than re-empowering a flotilla of small ships, which is our 130 plus local public health teams, which for 200 years have shown the world how to do public health. We need consistency, we need credibility, we need coherence, we need real leadership. The problem that we face in the short term is re-establishing trust with the business community, but also with young people who are now being blamed for this because they've not been allowed to get on and live their lives. We could have made that more possible for them if we'd done the testing properly, if we'd protected them and if we'd protected the vulnerable
Professor Sridhar,
people.
in the absence, we've talked about testing every single day, right since WHO said the way through is test, 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 and still 6 months later, we have a system where we cannot get tests when they're needed. We're not even clear how many people are getting tested. So in the absence of a effective testing regime, is lockdown a serious possibility, considering how devastating it is and how negative people are about it? More than 70% of our voters say they don't want one.
We've lost. I think you're on mute, Professor Sridhar. Sorry.
Oh,
there
sorry.
we go. That's all right.
We definitely don't want you silenced at this particular moment.
I was going to say, I mean, I'm just surprised that it's only 70% who are against lockdown. I think nobody wants another lockdown. And the main way to stay out of lockdown is to have a functioning testing and tracing system. And I don't understand why that's not possible here when other countries have managed to get that up and going from January and February. I think that what we will see is a move away from lockdown and release to various levels of restrictions. And that's what we're going to see, which is trying to limit the amount of contact people have with each other while minimizing the effect on the economy and on society.
Let's just look at that then, because yes, it may not be the full lockdown we saw at the end of March, but if you tell households that they can't mix, that for a lot of people, for instance, if you live on your own, is effectively another lockdown.
I agree with that completely. And I think it's just, unfortunately, the situation we're in because we don't have a functioning testing and tracing system. I mean, I think the way we want to move is to quarantine just those who have the virus and get away from quarantining everybody. But I think we also need to be kind of, there's some comforting lies being thrown around, and I have to tell some unpleasant truths. But this is a virus. It's here. If it continues to spread, we will see hospitalizations increase. We are seeing that increasing. ICUs are going to fill up. This is just a fact of this virus. We're seeing it already in France and in Spain. So we only need to look abroad to see where this is going to go. So we really need to get a handle on it now. Otherwise, we are returning to those harsh lockdown measures. The longer we kind of kick the can down the road, as they were not going to deal with this problem. But lockdown itself doesn't change anything about this virus. I mean, all it does is put your problem 2 months later, 2 weeks later. So we need to have a better strategy, a longer term strategy, and some honesty and leadership from the government on the crisis that we're in, which is a pretty...
things which I'm afraid are woefully short in supply. Duncan, Bannatyne, in your former Dragon's Den capacity, if you were advising young entrepreneurs right now what the hell to do, what is the smart play? You're a very smart guy. You've made a lot of money by, working the system in difficult times and good times. Right now, it's about as difficult as you can imagine for most businesses. Not all. Some are doing very well out of this. But for most young entrepreneurs, for example, young business owners, what is the advice you're giving people?
The advice is always it's very hard, and it's getting more and more difficult. And unless the government sorts out, as everyone says, the test and trace system, and we're getting top of this virus, it's always going to be difficult for young entrepreneurs or old entrepreneurs, as it happens, to survive and to continue. But the government has really got its. I mean, they keep coming out with a slogan like circuit breaker, and they seem to develop a policy behind that slogan, and it's just not working. And, I think Matt Hancock needs to resign and let's get somebody in who's decent who can look after the job he's doing.
Professor Ashton, on that point, I mean, Matt Hancock won't come on this programme to answer any difficult questions, but it is hard when you look back over the last 6-7 months to look at anything that this government or that health secretary has done which has worked or been consistent or been right. Professor Ashton, that was for you. Did you hear me?
Oh, sorry. Well, I totally agree, and I rehearse all of this in the book, and I hope people read the book because it looks as though we're just going to repeat everything all over again. I think what needs to happen is the Prime Minister needs to put his hands up and admit they've got it wrong and adopt a fresh approach, need to reach out across the parties to get a coalition approach to this, decentralise the response. That what should be happening is that the local public health teams should be asked how can they best be supported from Whitehall, not being told what to do all the time and then having it changed every 2 or 3 days with a new slogan. I mean, the slogan I would give you is slogans aren't working.
Yeah, I agree. Well, look, Blinded by Corona is your new book, How the Pandemic Ruined Britain's Health and Wealth. And it says, apparently, it's a devastating must-read, says Professor Devi Sridhar on the back. So it must be. So there's a meeting of great minds. Best of luck with the book. Thank you all very much indeed for coming on.